Aloha, I'm Felicia Miller Johnson, and I conduct work life video interviews with career professionals that become an all intuitive conversation. Aloha, and welcome to another episode of All Intuitive Conversation. I'm Felicia Miller Johnson, and my purpose is to bring light that encourages people to live smart and ascend to new levels of success in their work and their life. I had the pleasure of connecting today with Lorraine. Aloha, Lorraine.
Hi, Felicia. It's so lovely to be here with you today.
It is lovely to connect with you. So, you and I have not met before. And so, this is my first opportunity of getting to share energy and space with you. So, thank you for being open to having this conversation with me. And so, I was looking at your profile, and there were some things I was already aligning with that. But what I want to start with first is tell me a little bit about who Lorraine is.
Yes. Well, I do want to say first that who I am now is really different from what I was a long time ago, and I'm very grateful for that. And it's something my most recent project is a memoir I wrote about my life called Angels and Earthworms, An Unexpected Journey to Joy, Love, and Miracles. And what I realized writing that memoir was how all the things I thought were dead ends or all the big mistakes I thought I made actually led me to where I am right now, which is a place I'm very grateful for. So, briefly, I grew up in Southern California. In a very conservative Christian community, and I was a little misfit Jewish girl there. And I left LA and traveled some and lived in Mexico for a little while and fell in love with intercultural communication. Went back to school to become to teach to learn how to be an English as a second language professor,
Yeah.
and was a tenured professor for a while. Also came out as a lesbian and found true love, and I was unfortunately bullied and mobbed at this toxic academic institution. And though I love my students, I prayed for a new career and prayed to get out of there and found my way to the conflict transformation field and I blog, I coach, I teach, I help leaders in organizations to learn how to navigate conflict better, forgive themselves and each other. And then I was called to write a memoir about my whole journey. So it's kind of an amazing ride.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because you already had like two cards that came out, and one of them was this the rainbow and this happy family, right? But what is family is depicted as the traditional homogeneous, but it says a happy marriage, happily ever after, emotional contentment, a loving relationship of children, raising children wisely and successfully, people you can trust. So that kind of stood out when you were talking about that. You were living this whole other life, what people think is the rainbow, but ironically enough, rainbows also often symbolizes the next community of here. Yeah, so it was like, okay, that's connecting with you.
my my now wife and I have been together 32 years, and we are happily married. And I think
Wow.
we're raising our inner children. We don't have actual children.
But is what is interesting is that, children, like you said, define that. And that can be lots of different things. People have relationships that are considered to be children. They're nothing but related whatsoever. But still can care for them in that mother figure type divine feminine energy, right? So yeah, it's not even so much that having given birth to children. Um, I- well, next what also came out was this young man here, and there's this whole dragon, and he has this fire and this flame and this passion thing going on. And it says optimistic, creative, impatient, news of exciting opportunities, allowing your creativity to soar, do things that fuel your passion, finish what you start. So the conflict resolution, what sparked that field for you?
Well, I think there's two parallel tracks. One was, my own personal spiritual path
Okay.
around forgiveness, around being a teacher, around facilitation. But also when I was a tenured professor and department chair too at this college, it was a very toxic, racist, um, pretty
Hmm.
awful place to be. And I was mobbed, which is bullying by a group of administrators and some other instructors who didn't like the package I was in, that I was a Jewish lesbian, that I was outspoken, that I was good at what I did,
Yep.
that I stood up for people of color on the campus and for my immigrant students. And there was one moment where I was forced to participate in a so-called mediation that was actually a let's gang up on Lorraine and tell her how horrible she is session. And it
Yeah.
was devastating and horrible. And I ended up with PTSD. However, at the same time, after I left, I thought, this can't be what a mediation is. And so I went looking for information about mediation, found a training program in conflict resolution, as it was called then. And from my first class, I fell in love with the field. So while I was still full time at the college, I got got certification in conflict resolution, discovered the whole new field of conflict coaching, where
Yeah.
instead of sitting down with two angry people, you could start working with one person and their story and their internal conflicts.
Hmm.
And um, it didn't happen gracefully the way I intended, but I was able to escape from academia and start doing business.
Okay. So that's definitely an experience. The fact that a mediation that came into sound like intervention of wanting to change you, which was interesting because the next card that kind of came out was the theme of receptivity. But it says the trigger, I am guarded. True statement, my heart is open. This is time for you to receive new information. Open your heart to receive it. So the question that comes here is that even though after that experience, how are you able to keep your heart open?
Oh, that's such a good question, Felicia. Well, you know, I was doing everything I could, both practically and spiritually, to survive. And one of the key pieces for me around my heart was about forgiveness. There was this defining moment where one more egregious thing had happened. There were so many.
Yeah.
I walked out of my office into the lobby, and in that moment, I was filled with hatred for everybody I saw. I was so angry that in that moment, I felt like I could just, you know, burn the
Burn up
place.
the place. Burn up the. I was like, burn up the place.
And
Uh huh.
as as I felt that, I thought, oh my God, I'm in trouble. Because I'm not someone who wants to hate people or hold
Right.
grudges or be violent. And I thought I already knew about forgiveness work and had started on a path of forgiveness. And I said, I have got to do forgiveness work
Mm.
around these people, not because I think what they're doing is okay, but because if I don't, my heart will shatter into a million bitter pieces and I will never recover.
Mm.
So I started praying for them every day. And my initial prayer was a little grudging. It was like, grant, and I had a whole list of people,
Uh
uh,
huh.
spiritual, emotional, and physical healing because they really need it.
Yeah.
And
Uh
grant
huh.
everything I want for myself. And over the years, I've refined it to I forgive these folks for all wrongs, real and imagined. I accept they were doing the best they could with the inadequate tools they had, and I give them with love to the divine. And, of course, it didn't keep me totally safe or fix everything, but it did protect my heart. Because I got, as a side effect, I did find some compassion for them. And I realized that they were so terrified of change, especially these older white men were so terrified of losing their unearned privilege that they felt like I was attacking their very being and they were justified in doing anything to stop me. Of course, it was a very skewed way of looking at the world, but I was doing the forgiveness work for myself and my heart, not for them.
So you were being charitable in regards to that, and then what also came out here was you were mastering your emotions.
Yeah,
Um,
and
it-
self interest.
yes.
Yes, yeah, and in not feeling like a victim, you know,
Mhm.
recognizing, I mean, I loved my students and I liked teaching. And if it hadn't been for these horrific experiences, I might never have left. I,
Mm.
that wouldn't have been a tragedy. But the work I do around conflict transformation is truly my soul's purpose. And I might not have found it without that, the alligators and dragons.
Right. Things that's, what you think is attacking you. So what's interesting is that when I was connecting with you, Lorraine, do you know what your name means?
I've never been able to find what the name Lorraine means.
Okay. So Lorraine means famous army.
Hmm.
And what was connected and drawn to me was that now that you're in this work of conflict management, and oftentimes when people may think of army, they think of war, conflict, all of that, right? So it's interesting that your name actually kind of means that, but yet you're doing the opposite in order to help mediate conflict and arguments and everything, which is so interesting too, because the essential oil that I happened to pick for today was peace. So I was like, of course, which is what she's all about in the peace.
Mhm.
So what is it that you would say is one of the leading causes for people to have conflict?
Okay, well, I do want to say that army could mean an array of tools, which is what I feel like I help people get an army of tools to help them with.
Yes.
But, one of the things I kind of knew before, but I've come to understand even more about conflict and its sources, is
Hmm.
that depending which expert you talk to, between 60 and 90% of it is internal, which is why I love so much doing the one on one coaching. Because what I do with that is really listen to people's stories and how they see what's happening to them, how they see themselves and others, and give them a lot of empathy. And
Hmm.
then, ever so gently, I start asking them, how might the other person see it? Could they have a different story? Could they have a different perspective? Because we often think that other people are doing things to us, that they intend to harm us. And of course, there are malicious people, but most people are just doodling along their own story and not realizing the impact they have on you. And when I've done this work, especially with two people at a, like two people in the C suite or managers who are in conflict,
Hmm.
and I do this work with them separately, it opens their hearts. And they do understand that there are other ways of looking at what they thought was this fixed story of harm done. And when they do that, they can have a whole different kind of conversation.
Indeed. So it's like you're bringing nurturing, which is this other card that had came out here, the theme, which is nurturing. But the trigger statement, a lot of conflict is like, it's all in my head. And like
Yeah,
a lot of times it's those thoughts that you think it's one thing, but it's really something else. Like I said, it's internal, and so it's like you're helping to facilitate those type of those conversations
I
with
have
that.
a very dramatic example of this that I love to use with my clients and students.
Yeah.
I had a new client. This was on Zoom,
Hmm.
and forgotten to check that she'd paid me ahead of time. They usually pay me, and so I thought, well, she'll pay me afterwards. And we had the session, and 10 minutes before the end of the session, which I thought was going well, she
Yeah.
vanished. And first, I thought it was a tech issue, and I'm waiting for her to come back, and she doesn't come back. And then
Hmm.
I'm texting her and realized I only had a landline, and then I tried leaving a voicemail, nothing. And I didn't hear from her. And I had a whole story like, how could she ghost me like this? She's supposed to be working on being more in integrity as a professional. How could she,
Mm.
even if she didn't want to keep working with me, blah, blah, blah. I had a real head of steam around it. So I
Hmm.
voiced her one more time and then let go of it. And then I heard from her a month later. And at the moment she'd been on the Zoom call with me, a tree had fallen on her house. And no,
Well.
and fortunately, she was okay. But after I was, glad she was okay and relieved that she hadn't ghosted me, I started laughing because the story I was telling and what had actually happened were so diametrically different. And it's a great example of how far off we can be in the way we frame things of what the other person's reality is.
Hmm. You know what I love that you shared about that story is that although you are doing this work and you're coaching and developing other individuals, that you were vulnerable enough to share that story, that even in the midst of that, like, it's still something that as coaches, as individuals, that we still experiencing those challenges, ourselves. And so I appreciate you being honest about that. Like, yeah, I created a whole story in my head. She ghosted me, and
Well,
a whole inner conflict. And it was like, oh, she, which is interesting. This tree, like she had this whole tree to fall on her house, right? Then I kind
yeah,
of made all of
yeah.
that up. So it's like, okay, got that.
When when I work with newer conflict resolution people, conflict transformation people or mediators, I always tell them that the most important thing they can do to
Mhm.
be good at this kind of work is to do their own inner work. Because you know this, I'm sure. We can go a little bit past where we are personally because it's so much easier to see things for other people. And of course, we can bring in our intuition and divine energy. But if we haven't done the work, we miss so much. And I know for me that the way I consciously tell stories on myself to my students and clients, it invites them to be vulnerable as well, to know that they don't have to be perfect to do this
Yes.
work, that we're all works in progress.
Yes. Hmm. Interesting. So I was wondering, I was like, okay, what is Lorraine channeling here for? Because you mentioned divine, and I was shuffling divine feminine decks. Like, what is she um channeling here? And so what came out was Bridget, the
Uh,
goddess of the internal flame, and it says, "I am an internal flame, and each day my light grows brighter." So, with this work, how do you ensure that your light is not blown out? Because you deal with a lot of
mhm.
conflict. So, how do you ensure that you stay encouraged, that you stay lit? Like, what practices do you do to maintain that light?
Yeah, well, one thing is that in terms of, some people think conflict and they go, ah,
Mm-hmm.
and as long as I'm coaching people, et cetera, when it's conflict, I think yum, yum, because I've had so much success helping people that it nourishes me, that I'm able to help them open their hearts, able to help them forgive. So
Yes.
that's one thing. And I rely a lot on the divine. I do channel intuitively, especially when I was starting with coaching, because
Mm,
training didn't feel adequate for that of how I wanted to work as a conflict transformation coach. So
uh-huh.
I relied on the divine. And also I'm humbly aware that I'm always learning and growing and trying to get better. And that helps
Yes.
me once too, that it's not just about putting out, it's about taking in new information. And writing the memoir, which has been a whole other journey in itself, has also nourished me. I mean, I launched the book
Mm-hmm.
um, about 6 weeks ago, and I did it. It was a 5 year process to write the book, get a lot of help with the book, overcome all the writer's blocks and the inner criticism says, "Who do you think you are to write a book?" And the fact that I'm putting it out there sometimes feels overwhelming, but it
Mm,
also nourishes me. And and I love taking long walks, and I pray and meditate, and I spend time with my wife. And I have to remind myself a lot that I'm not in charge. I'm not
mm,
in my life. I'm not in charge of my client's life. I'm not in charge of how much my book sells. And when I remember that all I can do is, look in my heart and my spirit and my head and think, keep working on my attitude and love, that helps me too.
love that. So Bridget had some encouraging words. So this is what this card says. There's one moment when you're making your way through the dark, and suddenly, after what feels like days or months or even years, as you're talking about writing this book for 5 years, a ray of light comes through to you. A lightning happens. Each step isn't quite as hard to make as the one before, and you feel a great shift begin, as if now you're headed towards something new, something even brighter. Bridget is the essence of the first flame, that first ray of light. Bridget reminds us that the darkness never lasts. Bridget's internal flame represents the truth that the light never leaves us and can never be extinguished. It simply gets obscured or blocked from us. She reminds us that every day is actually filled with lights, that there are many days and times in our lives when we endure thick cloud cover, which sounds like that's what you endured for years at that institution, when that flame that exists within us is blocked by pain or confusion. Bridget is the sweet sound that reaches us in the dark and reminds us that we have never been on this journey alone. Bridget is our sign that the dawn is here because we have made it through the dark winter. We can lift our head, the healing has happened, and now each next day is bound to be brighter.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
So she
That
is
reminds
connecting with.
me of something the goddess said to me recently in
Hmm.
channeling was, you will find your way, you will find your way, you will find your way. I am with you, and you cannot get lost.
You cannot.
Yeah,
Indeed. Well,
yes.
Lorraine, thank you so much for connecting with me today. So, if those are out there, they're thinking, they're like, hey, I want to connect with Lorraine. She has conflict management skills. How can they reach you?
Well, you can reach me through my website, conflictremedy.com. And that's also where you can find out about my memoir, Angels and Earthworms, places to get it. And I have two newsletters, one for Conflict Remedy and one for the book with special offers and little excerpts from it and little spiritual things. So I would love to connect with people either way. And you can find both of them, conflictremedy.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for connecting with us. Thank you for those that had. Oh, you had something else? Uh-huh.
If since we were talking about forgiveness, if they do sign up for the Bookie Chronicles
Mm-hmm.
newsletter, which is available through conflictremedy.com/book, I my free gift to people is two forgiveness prayers that they get right away.
Love that. So you don't have to wait to get the information. So I love that right away. So thank you for those that have watched. I do hope that you have been encouraged to live smart and ascend to new levels of success. And until we meet again, this has been an all intuitive conversation.